He buried his wife and son on the same cold morning, and after that, he never spoke another word to anyone for 5 years. The townspeople called him a ghost walking among the living. But when 7 Apache women appeared at his gate, starving and hunted, he made a choice that would shatter his silence forever. He let them in, and what happened next became the greatest love story the Arizona Territory had ever witnessed. The Arizona Territory had a way of swallowing men whole. It took their dreams first, then their words, and finally their hearts. Elijah Crane had given all 3 to this land, and in return, it had given him silence. Folks in the town of Copper Springs talked about him the way they talked about ghost stories and old legends. They said he had been different once. They said he had laughed loud enough to shake the rafters of the saloon. They said he had danced with his wife beneath 100 stars while the fiddle played until dawn. But that was before the fever took her. Before it took their infant son 3 days later. Before Elijah Crane became the rancher who spoke to no one. 5 years he had lived on that stretch of land at the foot of the Dragoon Mountains. 5 years of conversations with cattle and horses. 5 years of letting his voice rust like an abandoned plow left out in the rain. The townspeople stopped trying after the 2nd year. The preacher gave up after the 3rd. By the 5th year, Elijah Crane was just a shadow that moved between the general store and his property line. A man who paid in coins and communicated in nods. He preferred it that way. Grief was easier to carry when no one asked you to explain its weight. It was October when they arrived. The autumn wind carried the scent of change across the mesa, and Elijah had just finished repairing the fence along his eastern pasture when he saw the dust cloud rising from the canyon trail. He watched with the patience of a man who had learned that most troubles passed by if you stayed still enough. But this trouble did not pass by. 7 women emerged from that dust cloud, walking in a line that spoke of exhaustion and determination in equal measure. They were Apache, their traditional clothing torn and weathered, their faces carrying the kind of weariness that came from walking too far with too little. The oldest among them might have seen 60 winters. The youngest could not have been more than 16, and leading them all was a woman whose eyes held fire even as her body trembled with fatigue. Her name, he would later learn, was Nalin. It meant maiden of the corn, though there was nothing gentle about the way she stood at the edge of his property and refused to move. Elijah walked toward them slowly, his hand nowhere near his holster. He had seen enough violence to know it when it approached, and these women carried none of it. They carried something else entirely. Desperation, perhaps, or maybe just the terrible hope of people who had run out of places to run. Nalin spoke first, her English careful and precise. They had been forced from the reservation after the soldiers came looking for men who had fled. The men were gone, scattered into the mountains to fight or die on their own terms. The women had been left behind, deemed useless until someone decided they might be useful as hostages or examples. So they had walked. They had walked for 12 days through territory that did not want them, past towns that threw stones and ranches that fired warning rounds into the dirt at their feet. They needed water. They needed rest. They needed one night of not looking over their shoulders. Elijah should have pointed west toward the creek that ran through public land. He should have nodded and returned to his fence work. He should have done what the silent version of himself had learned to do so well. Instead, he stepped aside and gestured toward his well. That first night, he gave them the barn. He brought blankets from the chest he had not opened since Margaret died. He cooked beans and salt pork in quantities he had not prepared in years, and he left the food at the barn door without waiting for thanks. Through the window of his ranch house, he watched the glow of the lantern he had given them and wondered what madness had taken hold of his mind. The next morning, he found his horses fed and brushed. His water troughs had been filled. The tools he had left scattered near the fence were organized neatly against the barn wall. The youngest of the women, a girl named Itza, was attempting to repair a saddle with techniques that would have impressed the finest leatherworker in the territory. He had not asked for any of this. When he approached Nalin about leaving, she met his eyes with a steadiness that made something shift in his chest. They would go, she said. They had always planned to go. They were walking to Mexico, where they had family who might take them in. But the old woman, Yanaha, had developed a fever. The girl, Itza, had worn through the soles of her shoes to the point of bleeding. They needed 3 days, perhaps 4. Then they would be ghosts again, and he could return to his silence. Elijah nodded. 3 days, perhaps 4. The days stretched. Yanaha's fever broke, but her strength did not return quickly. Itza's feet began to heal, but walking remained painful. And somewhere in the space between sunrise and sunset, Elijah Crane began to notice things he had trained himself to ignore. He noticed the way Nalin hummed while she worked, songs in a language he did not understand but felt in the marrow of his bones. He noticed how Cocheta, the woman with the crooked smile, could calm the most anxious of his horses with nothing but her presence. He noticed Mika and Shima, the twin sisters, working together in a rhythm that spoke of a lifetime of shared labor. He noticed Hanavi, quiet and watchful, who seemed to appear wherever help was needed before anyone asked. He noticed Yanaha, even in her weakness, teaching the younger women with a patience that reminded him of his own grandmother. He noticed Itza, barely more than a child, approaching the world with a curiosity that Margaret would have loved. And he noticed Nalin. He noticed her far more than he should have. She had a way of looking at him that suggested she saw more than he showed. When she caught him watching one afternoon, she did not look away. She walked toward him instead, stopping close enough that he could see the amber flecks in her dark eyes. "You have not spoken a word since we arrived," she said. "But you speak through your actions. You speak through blankets brought in the night, through meals left at doorways, through the way you pretend not to check on Yanaha's breathing when you think we are asleep." She paused, and something like understanding passed across her face. "You are not silent because you have nothing to say. You are silent because you said everything to someone who could no longer hear you." The accuracy of her words struck him like a physical blow. For a moment he forgot how to breathe. For a moment he was back in that cabin 5 years ago, holding Margaret's hand while she slipped away, talking to her about the future they would never have, the son they would never raise, the life that was ending before it truly began. When he finally asked, "Poke," his voice emerged rough and broken from disuse. The sound of it startled them both. "Her name was Margaret," he said, and it was the first time in 5 years he had said his wife's name aloud. That night he sat with the women around the fire they had built behind the barn. He did not speak much, but he listened. He listened to Yanaha tell stories of the old ways, her voice carrying the weight of generations. He listened to the twins sing songs their mother had taught them. He listened to Itza ask questions about the stars, and received answers from Nalin that wove science and myth into something beautiful. He listened, and somewhere in that listening, he began to remember what it felt like to be part of something larger than his own grief. The 3 days became a week. The week stretched toward 2. Elijah stopped pretending he wanted them to leave. Instead, he began to build. He added rooms to the barn, transforming it into living quarters. He taught them which crops grew best in the Arizona soil, and learned from Nalin the indigenous techniques that made water stretch further and harvests grow stronger. He gave them horses and received in return the knowledge of medicines made from desert plants that his own doctor had never known. He showed them the basics of ranch work and discovered they had skills that surpassed his own in a dozen different areas. The townspeople noticed the change. They saw Elijah Crane at the general store, purchasing fabric and seeds and tools in quantities that suggested he was no longer living alone. They saw Apache women riding horses that bore his brand. They saw, and they talked, and eventually they came calling with demands that he explain himself. Sheriff Thomas Wakefield arrived with 3 deputies on a morning bright with sunshine. He had papers, he said. There were laws about harboring reservation escapees. There were procedures. There were expectations about how things should be done in civilized territory. Elijah met them on his porch, and for the first time in years, he spoke loudly enough for all to hear. "These women are under my protection and in my employ," he said. "They work my land. They live on my property. And any man who tries to remove them will answer to me." The sheriff sputtered about legalities and consequences. The deputies shifted uncomfortably on their horses. Behind Elijah, 7 women stood in a line that no longer spoke of exhaustion. It spoke of something else entirely. It spoke of home. The standoff lasted 3 hours. It ended when the preacher arrived, the same preacher who had given up on Elijah years before, and reminded the sheriff that the law was not always the same as justice. The sheriff and his men left with threats that eventually amounted to nothing. The preacher stayed for dinner and left with a promise to return. That night, Nalin found Elijah standing alone on the ridge that overlooked the valley. The moonlight turned the desert silver, and the silence between them held none of the awkwardness it might have held with anyone else. "Why did you let us stay?" she asked. "That first night, why did you step aside?" He considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Because you reminded me of something I had forgotten, that survival means nothing if you survive alone, that grief can become a prison if you let it, that Margaret would have hated who I was becoming." Nalin moved closer, her shoulder brushing against his. "And now, what do you feel now?" The answer came easier than he expected. "Alive," he said. "For the first time in 5 years, I feel alive." She turned to face him, and in her eyes he saw something that looked like the beginning of a different kind of story. Not the story of a man who lost everything. Not the story of a woman fork Ed to flee her homeland. But perhaps the story of 2 people who found in each other a reason to keep building. He kissed her beneath that Arizona moon, and it felt like both an ending and a beginning. It felt like saying goodbye to the man he had been, and hello to the man he might become. The seasons turned. Yanaha regained her strength and became the grandmother figure the ranch had never known. Itza grew into a young woman whose knowledge of horses made her invaluable to ranchers across 3 counties. The twins married brothers from a neighboring property and built homes within riding distance. Cocheta discovered a talent for training animals that brought clients from as far as California. Hanovi became the healer that people trusted more than any trained physician, and Nalin became his wife. They were married on the first day of spring, with the preacher officiating and half the town in attendance. The same town that had once thrown stones now brought gifts. The same territory that had rejected 7 weary women now acknowledged them as neighbors and friends. It was not perfect. There were still whispers. There were still moments when old prejudices reared their ugly heads. But there was also change, slow and steady, like water wearing down stone. Elijah Crane had spent 5 years speaking to no one. He had spent 5 years building walls around a heart that he believed had died with his wife and son. But 7 Apache women had walked out of the dust and forced him to remember that grief was not meant to be a permanent residence. They had forced him to care again. He kept a picture of Margaret on his bedside table. He told Nalin about her often, and Nalin listened without jealousy, understanding that love was not a finite resource. He visited the graves of his wife and son every Sunday, and sometimes Nalin walked with him. Sometimes she brought flowers from the garden that the 7 women had planted together. The ranch grew, the family grew, and the rancher who spoke to no one became the rancher who could not stop talking about how fortunate he was. How 7 strangers had become 7 daughters, 7 sisters, 7 reasons to greet the morning with something other than resignation. On the last night of his story, years later, when his hair had gone gray and his bones had grown weary, Elijah Crane sat on that same ridge with Nalin beside him. Their grandchildren played in the valley below, Their home overflowed with laughter and noise and the beautiful chaos of a life well lived. "I spoke to no one for 5 years," he said quietly. "And then you appeared, and I have not stopped speaking since." Nalin smiled, the same fire still burning in her eyes after all this time. "You did not need someone to speak to," she replied. "You needed someone to listen. You needed someone to remind you that your story was not over." He kissed her hand, feeling the familiar calluses of a life built on hard work and harder love. "No," he agreed. "It was only just beginning. And somewhere, in whatever quiet place souls go when they leave this world," Margaret smiled, because she had loved him enough to want him to live. And finally, gloriously, devastatingly, he had learned how.